To today's deep dive. We're genuinely thrilled that you could join us.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in.
Whether you are listening while commuting or, taking a walk or just taking a moment to sit and catch your breath, we have a really intriguing theological and philosophical framework to explore with you today.
It's a really fascinating one.
It is. Today's source material is a single text. It's relatively brief, but man, it is incredibly concentrated in its messaging. It's titled The True Value of Life and Eternal Hope. And our mission for this deep dive is to map out the architecture of the ideas presented in this text. We're going to be unpacking some of its striking metaphors about human existence, the concept of eternity, and the ultimate pursuit of meaning as defined by this specific worldview.
And it is a remarkably dense piece of writing. I mean, frameworks like this are fascinating from an analytical perspective because they attempt to answer the most massive existential questions: origin, purpose, destiny, in just a handful of declarative sentences.
Right? They build a whole universe really quickly.
Exactly. They construct a complete lens through which to view reality. And I think it's crucial to establish our parameters right out of the gate here. We are here strictly to examine the concepts, the rhetorical choices, and the structural logic of the ideas presented in this text.
Just looking at the mechanics.
Right. We are acting as your guides to help you deconstruct this specific theological architecture. We aren't here to take a personal stance on the theology or to endorse the viewpoints. Our objective is to impartially break down the content so you can understand the exact mechanics of what the author is communicating and, the function of the imagery being utilized.
That is the perfect way to set the stage. We are looking at the blueprint of this belief system. We're analyzing the load-bearing walls and the foundational arguments. And the way this text lays its foundation is, well, it's anything but subtle.
No, it really goes right for it.
It immediately confronts the reader with a jarring spatial comparison. Okay, let's unpack this. The text argues that if we live our lives looking exclusively at the ground, remaining completely immersed in earthly matters and worldly values, we are quite literally living like insects.
It is an arresting opening image.
It's super aggressive. Characterizing human ambition or even just everyday human distraction as living like insects feels like a pretty stark, almost pessimistic accusation. How does the argument justify that leap right from the start?
Well, it's deliberately provocative. It's intended to strip away the veneer of human dignity we usually attach to our earthly pursuits. What's fascinating here is how the text uses physical posture, the act of looking down, versus the act of looking up to represent our ultimate epistemological and spiritual priorities.
So the posture is the theology.
Exactly. By selecting the insect metaphor, the author isn't just calling human beings small. They are targeting our scope of awareness. Consider the sensory world of an insect. Its entire universe is bounded by the few inches of soil immediately in its path.
Right, it can't see past the next pebble.
Yes. It operates strictly on immediate survival instincts. It's navigating the immediate obstacle, finding the immediate sustenance. It lacks the biological capacity to conceptualize the sky or the horizon.
Wow. Okay, so when you apply this lens to a modern day, for you listening, think about the emails, the financial planning, the career anxieties. The text essentially argues we're actively forcing ourselves into that same biological limitation.
We are.
We're choosing a tunnel vision that ignores a broader reality.
Precisely the argument. The author posits that when humans become entirely consumed by earthly matters, whether that's the accumulation of wealth, the pursuit of social hierarchy, or just the granular anxieties of daily survival, we are artificially shrinking our universe down to the dirt.
We're voluntarily making our world tiny.
Right. We are adopting a posture that is fundamentally beneath our inherent nature. The text constructs a dichotomy where caring primarily about worldly things isn't just a moral failing, it is a tragic reduction of what it means to be human. However, the framework doesn't leave the reader trapped in that pessimistic state. It immediately introduces the necessary counterposture. It calls the reader to look up to the sky.
And shifting that gaze upward, according to this specific framework, equates to choosing to live in alignment with the God who created humanity.
Right.
It's orienting one's life toward an eternal world where the soul ultimately resides. The upward gaze is an orientation toward the divine and the infinite, rather than the immediate and the finite.
It is a critical pivot in the text's internal logic. By establishing that the downward gaze is an inherently limited, almost pathetic mode of existence, it clears the ground for a dramatic reevaluation of value.
Because if the dirt isn't everything, what is?
Exactly. If the immediate earthly elements right in front of us aren't the ultimate reality, then the framework forces the reader to question how much psychological and spiritual weight those elements should actually carry.
Which transitions us seamlessly into how this text addresses the concept of human success and the brutal reality of finitude. Because the author doesn't deny that earthly success exists, or that it can be compelling.
No, it acknowledges it.
Right. The text acknowledges wealth and honor as real phenomena, but he counters those phenomena with an absolute, non-negotiable metric, which is the ultimate time limit. The text states unequivocally that no matter the volume of wealth or honor a person accumulates, it lasts, at an absolute maximum, 100 years.
The invocation of 100 years is a very specific, sobering mathematical boundary.
It really is.
On a purely human scale, living day to day, a century feels expansive. It represents a long, full lifespan. But the text is introducing a cosmic, eternal scale. When you place a century on the scale of infinity, 100 years is indistinguishable from zero.
It's a rounding error.
It's a rounding error. The theological architecture here relies heavily on this contrast between the finite and the infinite. The underlying argument is that if your entire universe, your accumulated wealth, and your curated social standing have a hard expiration date of a century, then investing your ultimate spiritual capital into them is a mathematically and philosophically flawed strategy.
And to illustrate that mathematical flaw, the author utilizes a rather melancholic, poetic comparison. The text states that the glory and riches of this life are fleeting, specifically likening them to the flowers of the grass.
Such a specific image.
It's a very deliberate rhetorical choice. The author doesn't compare human glory to a crumbling empire or an eroding mountain. The comparison is drawn to grass flowers.
It's an image that emphasizes not just temporary existence, but extreme fragility and near anonymity. A flower of the grass might bloom in the early morning dew and be completely scorched and withered by the harsh afternoon sun.
And nobody even notices.
Exactly. Furthermore, a field is full of millions of these flowers, blooming and dying largely unnoticed. The text is acknowledging that the glory of this life is real, and it can even possess a certain delicate beauty, much like that brief bloom. But it is fundamentally fragile. It cannot endure the elements of time. This inherent fragility is then placed in the sharpest possible juxtaposition with the text's concept of the eternal.
Because the text informs the reader that while earthly glory is a fading, fragile flower, the kingdom of heaven, the destination of the upward gaze, is fundamentally different in substance. It characterizes this destination as both eternal and an incredibly beautiful place.
That juxtaposition is the engine driving the text's primary argument. The reader is asked to weigh two ontological realities against one another. On one side of the scale, you have earthly wealth and honor that possess a fragile beauty but are destined to wilt and vanish within a strict 100-year window.
Right.
And on the other side, you have an existence that is characterized not only by incredible beauty but by permanence. The text uses this stark contrast to pose a rhetorical question. Given the biological and temporal limitations of human life, why would any rational actor choose to anchor their ultimate hope in a wilting flower when an eternal kingdom is presented as a viable alternative? Why persist in the downward, insect-like gaze when the eternal sky is accessible?
That setup certainly clarifies the problem and the proposed destination. We have the inherent tragedy of the downward gaze, obsessed with a century of fleeting glory, and we have the proposed solution, an incredibly beautiful permanent reality. But mapping out a destination is entirely different from providing a vehicle to get there.
That's the missing link.
Right. Here's where it gets really interesting, because the text pivots from this broad philosophical diagnosis to outline a very specific mechanistic theological solution. It details precisely how a person bridges the gap between the dirt and the eternal sky.
Yes, the structural logic of the text demands a mechanism of transit, and the core of that mechanism, according to this framework, relies entirely on the traditional mechanics of substitutionary atonement and grace through Jesus. The text explicitly states that Jesus shed his blood on the cross for humanity, stepping in to atone for sins.
It's worth examining how the author frames this transaction. The text notes that humans were originally destined to face tribulations and suffering. That was the established trajectory of the downward gaze.
The default path.
The default path.
Yeah.
But the mechanism of grace described here is strictly substitutionary. It outlines that Jesus took upon himself the very tribulations and suffering that humanity was meant to endure.
It functions as a total transfer of liability within the text's theological economy. The act of atonement detailed here isn't just a moral example. It is presented as a literal redemptive act that removes the individual from that destined path of suffering.
It rewrites the trajectory.
It does. If we connect this to the bigger picture, consider the massive ontological leap the text has just constructed. We began with the stark, pessimistic metaphor of living like insects, creatures bound entirely to the dirt, lacking any eternal awareness.
Stuck looking at the ground.
Right. But as a direct result of this substitutionary sacrifice, because the burden of tribulation was transferred and grace was applied, the text claims the individual is elevated to the status of a royal priesthood. Or, as the text also phrases it, priests and kings.
It is an incredibly drastic shift in identity,
Yeah.
moving from the lowest possible earthly baseline to the highest echelon of spiritual authority. Being designated as a royal priesthood completely rewrites the human value proposition. It shifts the individual from a state of inherent limitation to a state of absolute dignity and divine access within this eternal kingdom.
The rhetorical distance between insect and royal priesthood is vast, and the author uses that distance to underscore the magnitude of the grace being described. It isn't just a minor course correction, it is a total transmutation of nature.
It's a complete overhaul.
Exactly. However, the framework introduces a vital caveat here. This transmutation isn't presented as a passive event that simply washes over an oblivious humanity. There is an epistemological requirement placed squarely on the individual. The text categorizes the knowledge of heaven and this mechanism of grace as a secret or a key that Jesus has revealed to us.
The specific use of the words secret and key introduces an interesting tension. Categorizing this truth as a secret implies that the reality of the eternal kingdom and the mechanics of atonement are entirely imperceptible if you maintain that downward, insect-like gaze.
Worldly tunnel vision blinds you to it.
Right. It requires intentional revelation, and defining it as a key turns the theology into a tool. A key implies an action. It must be inserted and turned to unlock the entrance to the eternal kingdom.
That tension is a crucial part of the text's theological balance. The text explicitly issues an imperative, urging the reader to fully learn this knowledge in order to properly come before God. This demands active, rigorous intellectual and spiritual engagement.
You can't just hold the key.
You cannot passively hold the key. The framework requires the individual to study it, to fully internalize the knowledge it represents. It is a direct call to deeply comprehend the revealed truths regarding substitutionary atonement, the finitude of earthly life, and the elevated status of the royal priesthood.
So what does this all mean? We have mapped out some massive, sweeping theological concepts over the last few minutes. We have the psychological trap of the insect's gaze. We have the mathematical reality of the 100-year expiration date on worldly glory. We have the transactional mechanics of the cross and substitutionary atonement.
There's a lot of ground covered.
It is. We have the massive ontological shift to a royal priesthood and the active requirement to fully learn this secret key of knowledge. How does this specific framework instruct the reader to synthesize all of this into their daily existence? If a person fully internalizes this, how does it alter a Tuesday morning?
The text actually concludes with a highly practical application for daily living, derived logically from the preceding arguments. Because the individual has been granted access to this key, and because they are empowered by the grace of this atonement, the text argues that their daily priorities must undergo a radical reorientation.
So the day-to-day actually changes.
Radically. The author explicitly warns the reader against obsessing over the fleeting glory of the world. It circles back to the imagery of the grass flowers. The instruction is clear. Do not expend your severely limited 100-year temporal budget agonizing over elements that are guaranteed to wilt. It demands a complete recalibration of human anxiety and ambition.
It sounds like an argument against existential dread. If you know the ultimate destination is secure and eternal, the stakes of temporary earthly failures are drastically lowered. But wait, does the text advocate for complete detachment? If earthly glory is just a fading flower, does the author suggest we just sit out our 100 years waiting for eternity?
Not at all. It doesn't advocate for nihilism or passive waiting. In fact, it argues the exact opposite. The text calls the reader to follow the specific path that Jesus prepared. Because the ultimate tribulation was substitutionally taken, the path is now clear to live, as the text emphasizes each day with meaning.
Each day with meaning.
Yes, this implies active, purposeful preparation. Every single day of that 100-year span is meant to be utilized, infused with profound purpose, actively preparing for that eternal kingdom.
So the action might look the same from the outside. You might still pursue a career, build relationships, engage deeply with your community. But the internal motivation is entirely transformed. Your gaze is no longer locked on the dirt, striving for the fading flowers of worldly validation.
Exactly.
Your actions are now informed by the eternal reality. You're operating with the dignity and security of a royal priesthood, completely detached from the frantic survivalist anxiety of the insect.
Precisely. The framework systematically infuses the mundane with eternal significance. When a person adopts the belief that this finite life is merely a temporary prologue to a permanent, incredibly beautiful eternity, the challenges of the present moment become manageable.
They lose their sting.
They do. Furthermore, the successes of the present moment become appropriately sized. The individual is no longer crushed by temporary failure, nor are they intoxicated by temporary success, because they have fully internalized the knowledge that neither state will survive past the century mark.
We have covered incredible ground today exploring the architecture of this text. We started by examining the specific psychological trap the author outlines, the inherent danger of adopting an insect's downward gaze, becoming totally consumed by the immediate anxieties of earthly matters.
The dirt.
The dirt. We analyzed the stark mathematical reality check the text offers, confronting the strict 100-year limit on human achievement through the metaphor of the fragile flowers of the grass.
We then explored the structural alternative, the text constructs, the call to shift the gaze upward. We broke down the specific theological mechanics the author relies upon how, through the substitutionary atonement and grace of Jesus taking on destined human tribulations, an individual experiences a massive ontological shift, elevated from the dirt to the status of a royal priesthood.
And finally, we unpacked the text's ultimate call to action. The requirement for the individual to actively and fully learn the secret key of this knowledge, to recalibrate their anxieties away from temporary things, and to live every single day with deep, intentional meaning as preparation for an eternal reality. It is a framework that systematically demands a total reorientation of perspective.
It absolutely does. And to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over an angle to explore on your own that builds on this text's call to view life through an eternal lens, consider the interpersonal implications. We have talked a lot about how this framework changes your own internal motivations. But if you truly internalize this text's claim that every human being is either currently trapped in an insect-like tunnel vision of fleeting anxiety or possesses the potential to be elevated to an eternal royal priesthood, how might that fundamentally alter the way you interact with the people around you tomorrow?
That's a great question.
Think about it. If you truly internalize the idea that your current life is just a brief 100-year prologue to an incredibly beautiful eternity, how might that fundamentally change the very first decision you make when you wake up tomorrow morning? How does viewing a frustrating colleague or a stranger on the street through the dual lens of extreme 100-year finitude and eternal potential change the nature of your empathy and your patience?
That is a deeply challenging angle to consider. How does the eternal framework reshape not just our view of ourselves, but our view of each other? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the true value of life and eternal hope. We hope deconstructing this text has given you a fascinating new lens to consider. Keep asking rigorous questions, keep examining the foundational arguments behind the ideas you encounter, and keep seeking out new perspectives. We will catch you next time.